Hi, yes, so I'm Heather Dewey Hagborg. I'm an artist and a PhD student, as Kevin said. And if you're not careful, I might steal your DNA. Seriously. So I'm going to be talking to you today about this body of artistic work and also research that I've been developing over the past 2.5 years that I'm calling genetic insecurities. So this is essentially ways in which our genetic information is insecure, right? Like we're losing it all the time. And ways in which we're insecure about what that genetic information means, what it says about us. So for the past 2 years, I've been working on this project, Stranger Visions. How many of you have heard about this project before? Not too many of you. Okay, so this is good. So I'm going to explain the whole thing. So this is a project in which I create literal, figurative 3D portraits of people's faces, of strangers, from abandoned DNA that they leave behind in public. And so I'm going to start today by telling you about Stranger Visions and explaining how this project works and what I learned in the process of working on it. And then I'm going to talk to you about some new research that I'm doing right now, brand new. So genetic monitoring or surveillance has been the subject of science fiction for years, but today with the increasing accessibility and decreasing costs of biotechnology, it's becoming an ever more possible reality. So in this new world, the very things that make us human, hair and skin and saliva, right, our bodies, become a liability as we constantly face the possibility of shedding these traces in public and leaving artifacts which anyone, like me, could come along and mine for information. So in short, we're leaving our DNA around all the time without giving it a second thought. And so the research question that drove Stranger Visions for me was, how much can I find out about someone from a hair? How much can I find out about you from some trace piece of evidence that you leave behind without a second thought? And so I began by literally collecting forensic samples that strangers left in public spaces. Things like cigarette butts and chewing gum and hair and fingernails. And then I brought these into a lab called GenSpace. So GenSpace is a community laboratory in downtown Brooklyn. It's part of this kind of growing DIY bio citizen science movement that's all about getting ordinary people into labs and teaching them how to use the tools of molecular biology. So I went to GenSpace as a total amateur, really knew next to nothing about how biotechnology worked. And I signed up for a biotechnology crash course and then became a member of GenSpace and worked with the scientists there, and they taught me all of the basic tools to extract DNA and analyze it myself. So I extract the DNA, and then I amplify certain regions of the DNA that code for specific traits using a technique called PCR, polymerase chain reaction, which I'm sure you're all familiar with in this audience, right? So basically a sequence of heating and cooling of the DNA that, when done with the correct primers, will amplify subsequences that are correlated with specific traits. So for example, by amplifying certain regions of your mitochondrial DNA, I can make a pretty good guess as to where your mother's ancestors came from about 500 years ago, classified into these categories called haplogroups. And so what I'm looking at, generally speaking, are SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, places where DNA tends to vary a lot, person to person, by a single base pair. And these SNPs are correlated with traits, so things like weight and complexion and eye color and hair color, ancestry, and a handful of facial landmarks as well. So what I did was I created a master list of about 50 of these traits, and I gathered these from freely available published research. So I started with 23andMe. So I'm sure you're all familiar with 23andMe, the personal genomic profiling service. So 23andMe obviously has gotten a lot of media attention over whether or not they should be profiling people's disease risks, and they've had to stop that portion of their service. But I actually think 23andMe is a really great company, and I'll tell you the reason why I really like 23andMe is because When you get your DNA analyzed there and you look, for example, you go look at your list of traits and it says, we're pretty sure that you have blue eyes, they link to the actual research papers that they're basing that conclusion on. So you can follow it up and you can say, okay, well, I can make my own mind up as to whether I believe that or not. So for me, it was a really great way of digging into that research and saying, well, how do we figure out, what kinds of traits people have and how strong the accuracy is and these kinds of questions. So I created this list starting from 23andMe and then also working with a resource called SNPedia, right? So SNPedia is like Wikipedia for SNPs. And so I started pulling these resources together, made this master list, and then brought it into the lab and just started trying to go down it, trait by trait, trying to analyze these things using PCR. And so each of these SNPs is like a clue, right? It's an indication that gives me some sense of what this person might look like. And so I take all these clues and I feed them into a software model that I've been developing, which I'm repurposing from 3D facial recognition technologies. And so this 3D model of a face can be parameterized or changed based along different kinds of axes, right? So things like gender, things like weight, ethnicity, and certain facial traits and shapes and colors. So this is a short video I'm going to show you. I'm going to kind of narrate it for you that demonstrates the process that I went through in working on the piece as well as the result. This is GenSpace. So, So basic DNA extraction, PCR. Just manually checking out the gel. All very, very low tech, really. Bringing those results into software. So I was using the 3D morphable model I'm using is MATLAB based, and the interface to that I developed is in Python. So I'll start by first generating a few different versions of the virtual model of the face, and then it gets sent to a 3D printer and printed in full color as a life-size model of the face. And here you can see what it looks like exhibited. I'll show you a few more of the faces that I've made up close. Here she is again. Okay, so the first question that I usually get when I present this project, and I've presented it a few times, is about accuracy. And so to get that out of the way, this is the self-portrait that I generated using the same technology. So you can judge for yourself what you think the accuracy is. In my opinion, I think we don't look exactly alike, but there are similarities. For me, it's kind of like a family resemblance. So in my opinion, exact reconstruction of a face from DNA alone is still in the future, but we're getting closer and closer. So Stranger Visions is art, but it isn't science fiction. The project is drawn from published research, scientific papers, and data freely available online, and it manifests a new police practice that's known as forensic phenotyping. So already kits are available for police to analyze the hair color, eye color, and what's alternately called ethnicity, ancestry, or race from a DNA sample found at a crime scene. So there's a kit called H-IRIS-Plex that the police can use for looking at hair and eye color, and services like this analyze this ancestral information. So despite claims of genetic sameness that emerged in the wake of the Human Genome Project, scientists were simultaneously calculating frequencies to create associations between different genetic profiles and contrasting ethnic and racial groups. So this desire to find correlations pointing to race while simultaneously denying its existence is something that sociologist of science Troy Duster has called the molecular reinscription of race. So forensic phenotyping, I think, raises several potentially problematic issues from an ethical and a socio-political perspective. Last summer, a new company called Identitas launched a pilot program called Identify to generate phenotypes from crime scene DNA. In my perspective, essentially making the forecast of Stranger Visions a reality. Advertising the powerful, easy-to-use results you can trust obtained from their product, Identitas is clearly not aiming at a public debate on forensic phenotyping. The practice has been very little discussed and remains to be regulated in most US states and in most countries worldwide, leaving this gaping legislative hole that really makes all manner of ethically questionable forensic applications totally illegal. And the research continues, so most recently, Mark Shriver and Peter Claes showed that predictive modeling of faces from genetic information was feasible. So they were studying correlations between 3D scans of people's faces from different populations with different SNP profiles, and they're looking at correlations between facial shape and DNA. And so they found the two largest correlations were sex and genomic ancestry, as expected, and then they identified about 24 genetic variations with significant relationships to facial shape. And so this image shows how the faces in their data set vary based on the most significant genetic variables that they found. So it's becoming more possible. The research continues. We're moving forward with this stuff. So in my own research, I found that this kind of activity is regulated mostly on a state level in the United States, and it actually varies quite a bit state to state. So in terms of thinking about the legality of what I did, for example. And one of the biggest challenges that's actually facing the regulation or prohibition of this kind of activity, of this kind of genetic surveillance, right, is the accessibility of biotechnology itself. It's very difficult to prohibit. If I want to analyze your DNA, it would be almost impossible to stop me from finding some trace of you that you've left behind and analyzing it in my kitchen. So legislation will only take us so far. We need to think about these issues in a much broader cultural way as well. So what is the state of DNA surveillance today? 98% of babies born in the United States undergo mandatory genetic screening in the first few days of their lives. Again, it's under state regulation. So this screening varies tremendously in terms of how it's handled, in terms of what is tested, and what's done with the biological sample after testing. So in some states, it is stored permanently. And this is a practice that's being referred to as biobanking. Permanent retention of biological samples with the possibility of testing them later. In Uzbekistan, a new program of genetic testing is being established to spot future Olympians by testing all children, this is true, for predispositions for athletic abilities, and then putting them into a special track to train them. And they're hoping to launch this program in 2015, right around the corner. Paternity, maternity, siblingship tests are commonly used in immigration proceedings, and while termed voluntary, these expensive and potentially emotionally invasive tests are often the individual's only chance, their only opportunity to prove their right to citizenship, with some estimates that as many as 20% of these cases have unwanted outcomes, right? Have some outcome where you find out something that you wish you didn't know. There's even a mobile paternity truck called Who's Your Daddy that roams the streets of New York looking for customers questioning their lineage. You can't make this stuff up. And of course, criminal DNA databases are expanding rapidly. Law enforcement now routinely profiles individuals convicted of even petty crimes. They tend, again, toward the permanent retention of biological samples and profiles, and are collecting profiles from people who are arrested but not even convicted of a crime, right? So you could be totally innocent and have a biological sample of yours retained indefinitely. And in addition to expanding nationally, these databases are now connecting to an increasingly globalized DNA database network, which may include profiles from countries that have different standards of collection and analysis than in the United States. Finally, most recently, how many of you have seen this? Francis Gurry, Director General of the United Nations World Intellectual Property Organization, has been accused of serious misconduct for allegedly burglarizing his staff offices to obtain DNA samples, which he then compared against DNA taken from anonymous letters he received alleging financial impropriety on his part. Burglarizing staff offices to obtain DNA samples. So how do we maintain privacy in an era of genetic surveillance? How do we handle this? I'm sure many of you know this guy. So this is Kary Mullis, Nobel Prize winner for the invention of polymerase chain reaction, the tool that I'm using to amplify sections of DNA. In 1995, Kary Mullis joked about creating a company called DNA Anonymous. DNA Anonymous would sell amplified solutions of DNA that individuals could use for masking their genetic identity by degrading the integrity of the data that they're leaving behind. And while he was joking about actually creating this company, he predicted that somebody would in the next 10 years. That was 1995. In 2006, Rebecca Dent, a forensics researcher in Western Australia, essentially did just this, not creating the company, but creating the spray. By creating a DNA spray of contrived CODIS loci, right, so the sections of DNA that the FBI looks at to determine an individual's DNA fingerprint, and creating this spray and spraying it over a simulated crime scene. And what she found was that not only was this fake DNA detected, but often it was actually detected preferentially over an actual biological sample, like a blood stain. And this was just spraying this DNA over actual evidence. In 2009, a group of scientists in Israel proved that evidence could actually be completely fabricated with no noticeable differences from authentic evidence. In their paper, Authentication of Forensic DNA Samples, they spelled out exactly how one could go about creating a library of alleles based on a DNA fingerprint that could be placed together to replicate any particular profile. So in other words, to frame someone whose DNA fingerprint you knew. And they showed how this evidence could be generated from a found forensic sample like a cigarette butt. So if you're interested in this, check out their paper because they tell you exactly how to do it. So you wouldn't leave your medical records on the subway for just anyone to read. It should be a choice how you share your information and with whom, be it about your genes, your email, or your phone calls. And so today, I'm very excited to introduce you to my new project. And it's not only my new project, it's my new product. So Stranger Visions leaves us with the understanding that we're potentially entering this era of mass biological surveillance. And in such a world, we need new tools. We need instruments of counter-surveillance to protect our privacy. And so drawing on the research that I've just shared with you, I've developed a new product to protect your genetic privacy. And it's called Invisible.
We're going to be living in a surveillance state.
Science holds the key to our security and prosperity as a nation.
This is me.
My DNA.
People are being arrested simply to get their samples onto the National DNA Database.
Police can take DNA samples without a warrant
from anyone they arrest. Certain segments of the population will be subject to genetic surveillance.
Me.
You don't have to have done anything wrong.
You're all screwed.
Invisible, 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 invisible.
Sometimes I wish I was invisible. Have you ever wanted to be invisible? Now, you're invisible.
So Erase is a surface decontaminant. It gets rid of 99.5% of DNA left behind and obfuscates the remaining 0.5%. So this is a model of thinking about genetic privacy based off of thinking about computer privacy, thinking about electronic privacy. And maybe I don't want to leave my saliva behind on this glass this morning. So I've actually brought some prototypes with me. So erase and replace. This is how it would work. Oops. Early prototypes here. Okay, erase spray has gone defunct, but replace spray will still obfuscate my DNA. So the idea here basically is you're going to use erase to wipe away any DNA that you've left behind and use replace to obfuscate the rest. And leaving this glass behind, no longer do I have to worry about someone coming along and analyzing my genetic information. So to conclude here, Invisible isn't for sale yet, but I do actually plan to start selling this product in June, so next month. But for right now, you can check out our website. This is Biogen Futures is the name of the website. That's the domain, the name of the company. You can check out the website. You can follow it on social media. You can join the mailing list to keep updated on our progress. And so to conclude here, genetic privacy is an emerging issue that's quickly becoming vitally important. And I think Invisible is the first step towards making protection against new forms of biological surveillance accessible to the public. And I'm going to conclude by making a bold claim, which is that in 5 years' time, I expect genetic privacy products to be as commonplace as hand sanitizer. So, thank you.
We've got
got time for a couple, don't go away. We've got time for a couple quick questions. Maybe there are microphones browsing in the aisles if we have them. If not, just put your hand up and shout. We'll relay the question. Questions for him? And the other floating, yeah. Go ahead, please.
Hi, wonderful presentation, wonderful
you.
work. Did you try Facebook's face tagging feature to figure out whether the people that you would map to with your 3D samples would actually reside in Brooklyn or Manhattan?
Oh, that's an interesting idea. No one's actually suggested Facebook before as a way of tracking people down. But no, I haven't done that. Yeah.
I guess what I'm pointing out is that we have easier ways of tracking people.
Yes, we do. And that's a very good point. And I think for me, when I was working on Stranger Visions, I'm still working on it, but when I was starting to work on it, I had to think a lot about what boundaries I wanted to draw around that project. And for example, if I wanted to actually try to find those people, or if I wanted to analyze things like medical conditions. And I decided that just in terms of my own boundaries, I was most interested in sort of pointing to the issues without actually violating what I considered to be important privacy barriers myself. So for me, the face is kind of this index that points to the fact that these other things are becoming very possible. It allows me to do that without actually violating those people's privacy. And that's just, my opinion, that's my take on it. Other people have different opinions, but yeah.
The lady in the third row, go ahead. Yep.
How would you handle the social erase and replace can make it difficult to track criminals?
Heather, come on, please repeat the question, please.
So the question was, sorry, can you repeat it? How?
There's a social dilemma there. How do you
Social dilemma.
How do you track criminals when erase and replace is so pervasive?
Yes, okay, the criminal question. So this is the first and most obvious question. First of all, I think criminals will be a very small portion of our market share. Second of all, amplified DNA actually can already be detected. So the authentication of DNA samples paper that was published not only showed how to fake DNA evidence, but it showed how to test for fake DNA evidence. And one of the big questions here is, why aren't we testing for that right now? So I think that is a really big question. And then the third major point here is that we give way too much weight to DNA evidence alone. We really need to not think of just DNA alone as being conclusive proof that someone is guilty or innocent. So we need to think about kind of a bigger picture. But yeah, thanks for that question.
You may have answered it. Does Replace have its own signature so that a forensic person will know that it's Replace?
Yeah, so the question was, does Replace have its own signature so that a forensics analyst would know that it was this spray and not an actual person's? And so yes, it does. It will have a unique profile. It won't be sort of the iconic question mark, but it's something like that so that you could tell. The idea here is to obfuscate, not to sort of create fake evidence that could be planted.
I'm not sure if you're aware of the fact that in Germany there was a few years back where they chased sort of a phantom murder woman who was supposedly mass murdering across all of Germany
Yes.
at different sites and so on, and then they finally found out that that she was a lab technician in the company that produced the things where you pick up from the investigative sites.
Yeah, no, that's a great story. The Phantom of Heilbronn, I think. I'm not sure how to pronounce the place, but yeah. So this phantom was, yes, accused of doing all sorts of horrible crimes of wide variety. No one could figure out, how is this person committing all these different crimes? And then it turned out that it was a lab technician whose DNA had gotten onto the cotton swabs and was being amplified over and over and over again. And it points to these issues. I mean, it points to these questions that are coming out about touch DNA, for example, right? Touch DNA has become this new thing that's starting to be used in criminal investigations. And it's basically taking the tiniest samples of DNA, right? Just a few skin cells, and then amplifying and amplifying and amplifying it. So it's inviting a lot of errors.
Let's leave it there for now.
Okay.
We'll come back at the end. Thank you
Sounds
again,
good.
Heather Jury Hagberg. Great job.